Your billionaire husband didn't just file for divorce, he beat you and left you to bleed out in a trash-filled alley. But as your vision jaunt fades, the city's most ruthless mafia boss steps out of the shadows. He doesn't offer a hospital, he offers a cage. Adrian Romano just claimed you. Now, the man who wanted you dead is about to realize he threw away his wife to the one monsters he can't defeat. The cold rain hammers the cracked pavement, washing the warmth from Leah Vance as she bleeds out in a forgotten alleyway, discarded, tossed aside like garbage by Ethan, the very man who vowed to cherish her, the husband who slowly hollowed out her soul. As her heartbeat fades to a mere whisper, the shadows part for someone far more dangerous. Adrian Raw steps into the fading light. He is no savior. He is a man who collects broken things, trading one form of possession for another, binding her to him through the sheer gravity of trauma. Stick with me, because you and I are going to watch this tragedy unfold together. It teaches us a harsh but simple truth. Sometimes, merely surviving the night demands that we make peace with the darkest corners of the human heart. Let the camera linger on her broken body. The downpour tries to wash away the dark pooling beneath her, but the sheer volume of blood tells a grim story. Every ragged breath sends a jagged spike of agony through her shattered ribs. One eye is completely swollen shut, bruised a deep, tragic purple. She tries to move, but a blinding flash of pain steals the scream right out of her throat. The man who did this was no stranger in the dark. It was Ethan. 6 years ago, surrounded by smiling guests and a string quartet, he played the perfect gentleman, masking his cruelty behind warm coffees and sweet words. It serves as a painful reminder for us all. The most dangerous monsters often hide right behind the most beautiful, convincing smiles. For 2,000 days, Ethan chipped away at her spirit, turning a bright woman into a shadow, constantly walking on eggshells. So, tonight is the violent end to that quiet erasure. When he shoved her into the car, his eyes held no impulsive anger. Anger is human. His face was entirely blank, wearing the terrifying efficiency of a man closing a business deal. He dragged her into the wet street by her hair, delivering each blow with chilling focus. "You have become a liability," he whispered, his voice flat, as his fists connected with her trembling frame. He threw her away simply because he could no longer perfectly control her. It shows us a sobering reality. True cruelty is never born of fiery passion, but of complete, devastating indifference to another soul. She tried to plead with him, a heartbreaking response when begging a man who possesses no empathy. Her voice cracked into fragile sobs, while he stared down at her with the cold finality of tossing out old paperwork. He left her in that rotting alley to bleed out alone. As her vision darkened, Leah slipped into the quiet comfort of her own memories. She saw her mother's gentle face. She mourned the vibrant girl she used to be before Ethan sank his claws into her soul. Lying there in the mud, closing her eyes, forever felt like a blessing compared to living another day in constant fear. She completely surrendered to the dark. But life teaches us a strange lesson. Just when we finally accept the very end, fate intervenes. Slow, heavy footsteps suddenly echoed through the pouring rain. The steady rhythm of those footsteps held absolutely no hesitation. These were the heavy strides of a wolf, completely at home in the midnight shadows. Leah managed to force her good eye open just a fraction. A massive silhouette blocked the distant streetlights. For one terrifying second, her panicked mind thought Ethan had come back to finish the job. But this man moved differently. As the pale light caught his face, it revealed sharp, hardened features and eyes that had seen 1,000 horrors without ever blinking. He stopped right beside her broken body. There was no gasp of pity, just a long, calculating stare. It reminds us that salvation rarely arrives in shining armor. Sometimes it comes wrapped in the deepest darkness, silently evaluating the true cost of our survival. Leah tried to speak, but her ruined throat produced only a desperate rattle. The towering stranger crouched beside her. Up close, his violent past was carved into his flesh, marked by a jagged scar cutting through his brow. His dark eyes mapped her wounds with the precision of a mortician. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice a low rumble beneath the pouring rain. "My husband," she whispered. A tiny shift crossed his rigid face. It was not kindness. It was the terrifying focus of a predator catching a scent. "Ethan Vance says," he murmured, confirming a truth he already knew. He slipped off his coat and draped it over her shaking shoulders. It is a profound truth of life that, in our most shattered moments, even the shelter offered by a monster can somehow feel like a saving grace. You and I know exactly how this tragic dance begins. It is how the trap of dark control is set. "You are not dying in this alley," he told her, his tone empty of warmth. "I cannot go on," she sobbed, her spirit crushed. "Please, leave me." He stared down at a broken form. "You really want your story to end in the garbage?" "I just want the pain to stop," tears mixing with rain. "It will," he promised. He slid his arms beneath her back, sending a blinding wave of agony tearing through her spine. She let out a jagged cry. He lifted her easily, ignoring her weak, frantic struggles. It teaches us a haunting lesson. Sometimes the hands that finally pull us out of the grave only intend to lock us in a gilded cage of their own making. He moved through the storm with the chilling calm of a man who owned the night. "Who are you?" Leah gasped, tasting copper and rain as she choked on the words. "Adrian Romano," he answered. The sheer weight of that name struck her like a physical blow. In their city, Romano was a whispered ghost story. He was the ruthless king of the Underworld, a man whose reputation for absolute brutality made her husband's cruelty look like child's play. Her heart hammered against her broken ribs in pure terror. "No, I cannot go with you," she begged weakly. "You do not get a say in this anymore," he replied, locking her into the dark leather of his back seat before she could even try to run. "We must remember this bitter truth. Trading a known devil for an unknown demon rarely brings true freedom. Let us look closer at this terrible shift in power." Her body was rapidly shutting down. Romano laid her across the expensive car seats with terrifying detachment, touching her not with kindness, but with the steady grip of a man evaluating a stolen painting. "Why are you helping me?" Leah cried softly, searching his face for a drop of mercy. His dark eyes locked onto hers, empty of warmth, yet burning with a dangerous possession. "I am not helping you," he whispered, sealing her fate in a single breath. "I acquired you." A sharp prick bit into her neck, and heavy, chemical darkness instantly dragged her under. It is a harsh lesson about human vulnerability. True powerlessness is not the moment we fall, but the moment another person completely decides if we are allowed to wake up at all. Stay with me, because this is the moment the invisible chains are forged. Leah woke to a heavy, suffocating silence designed to make her question reality. Her blurred eyes drifted to a soaring ceiling lined with rich trim. She was buried in a massive bed, her skin wrapped in expensive silk that did not belong to her. While she slept, foreign hands had remade her. Her broken ribs were tightly bound. A steady, numbing haze of painkillers drifted through her blood, thus dulling the sharp agony of Ethan's betrayal. Romano had meticulously stitched her broken body back together. But in life, we must realize a dangerous truth. When a monster heals your deepest wounds, it is only so you are finally new, strong enough to quietly endure the beautiful new cage they have built for you. The horrifying realization that a stranger had dressed her wounds and locked her in this room, sent a wild jolt of panic to her heart. A raw fear took over. She threw herself upward, desperately trying to escape the bed, but it was a terrible mistake. A white-hot blade of pain ripped through her side. Biting her lip until she tasted blood, she forced herself up against the dark headboard. Her wide eyes scanned the room. Heavy velvet curtains choked out the sun. The main door looked as heavy as a bank vault, and a second doorway showed only a cold marble bathroom. Shaking, she slid her bare feet over the mattress edge. It proved the survival instinct never sleeps. Even when our bodies are broken, the human spirit desperately searches for a way out of the dark. Every movement sent alarms through her nerves, but Leah stubbornly forced herself to stand. Her stomach trembled violently. Gripping the bedpost, she took deep, ragged breaths to keep from fainting. The heavy door clicked open. A woman in a sharp suit walked in, carrying a tray with water and pills. "You are not strong enough to walk," the woman stated, her voice entirely hollow. "Where am I?" Leah demanded, holding her chin high. "The Romano estate." "I need to leave right now," Leah shot back. The woman stared at her with terrifying, cold authority. It offers a bitter lesson about pride. The master of the house already knows you will collapse long before you ever reach the bottom of the stairs. Sometimes, the absolute cruelest cages we find ourselves trapped in are simply the ones with open doors. Margaret stood perfectly still, dismantling her piece by shattered piece. "If you keep fighting, I will just let you," she stated. Leah pushed up, her voice shaking. "This is unlawful detention." The operative offered a devastating correction. He stepped in to keep your heart beating. "I never asked for his help." Leah snapped back. "No," Margaret agreed, her tone chilling the room. "You were entirely occupied with the process of dying." The absolute truth of that statement drained the remaining fight out of Leah. Margaret laid out the stark reality: rest and heal, or resist and hurt. We often think outside forces hold us back, but sometimes our own broken bodies become the ultimate cage. Defeated, Leah sank into the heavy mattress, completely crushed by the total loss of her own choices. "Let us step into this darkened room together, you and I, and watch the tragedy unfold." The camera pans across a heavy silver tray, painkillers, antibiotics, a glass of water. Margaret places it down with a hollow clatter. Leah shrinks back against the pillows, her eyes wide, trapped in the frantic hypervigilance of a hunted animal. "Are these safe?" she whispers. Margaret looks down at her with brutal, clinical coldness. "If Mr. Romano wanted you dead, you would be dead. It is the absolute logic of a predator." Leah swallows the pills dry, her shaking hands betraying her shattered nervous system. Margaret nods, promises a meal in 1 hour, and the heavy door clicks locked. The tragic reality of the abused mind is this: we often flee one controlling monster only to blindly lock ourselves inside the beautiful cage of another. The lighting shifts, catching the fading purple contusions on Leah's cheek. 3 days dissolve in the silence of isolation. Her fractured ribs ache less, but the psychological dread deepens. Her husband had a clear objective. He wanted her dead, but the motives of Adrian Romano remain buried in shadow. Margaret materializes 3 times a day, moving with the cold efficiency of a warden. When Leah begs for a phone or her coordinates, the answer is always a flat refusal, dictated from above. It is a gilded prison, bathed in soft sunlight. A simple truth we must all learn is that comfortable cages are still cages. They are designed to strip away your autonomy piece by piece until you simply surrender to the locked doors. You and I should look closely at the set design of her captivity. The room is breathtaking, yet utterly inescapable. The towering windows are permanently sealed. The heavy oak door is locked from the outside. She is granted every comfort except the fundamental right of freedom. On the fourth day, the deadbolt slides back. Adrian Romano steps into the frame. Leia is curled by the window, staring at the gardens she can touch. At the heavy thud of his footsteps, her spine snaps straight. He lingers near the exit, hands resting in his pockets. He dissects her with the clinical method of a syndicate leader evaluating his property. He controls the very air in the room, proving himself an absolute master of environmental manipulation. "You are healing well," he observes. His voice void of human empathy. Leia remains still. They remain still, offering no verbal response to his baseline test. "Margaret says you have been cooperative." Her jaw clenches. "What do you want from me?" she demands, her voice sharper than her defensive posture. Adrian takes a seat opposite her, projecting absolute physical relaxation and total dominance. "We need to talk," he states. "Then talk." He leans forward. "Your husband tried to kill you." A violent micro-expression of grief tears across her face. "I know that," she whispers. "Do you know why?" "Does it matter?" She deflects. "Yes." Adrian presses. "You were the Ethan Vance was drowning in corporate debt, hunted by unforgiving predators. He desperately needed a pawn to survive the coming storm. He targeted the Viscari family." "I do not understand," she breathes. "He used you as bait, depositing you in my territory, knowing I would locate you." A visceral drop hollows out her stomach. "Why would he assume that?" "Because I control that sector," Adrian stones, his tone dripping with the grandiosity of a true megalomaniac. "He wanted me to react. If I took you, Ethan could approach the Viscaris, claiming victimization by my organization. If I ignored you, you would expire, and he would play the grieving widower for public sympathy." The crushing psychological weight of this betrayal hits Leia like a physical blow. Her knuckles turn white against the armrest. He planned all of it just to close a business deal. Adrian simply nods, confirming the grim reality. Leia had spent years documenting Ethan's capacity for violence in the dark ledgers of her mind. But this profound level of calculation, this sociopathic disregard for her humanity, shatters her core psychological schema. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispers, her reality unraveling before our eyes. "Because you deserve to know the precise market value of your life to him," Adrian replies. "And what is it worth to you? That depends entirely on whether you wish to survive or merely exist." "I do not belong in your dark world," she counters, her chest heaving. "You did not belong in his, but you stayed." "I had no choice," she defends weakly. The man slowly stands, adjusting his tailored suit. "You always have a choice. I will provide a vehicle to take you anywhere you desire. Stick with me here, because this is where the trap is masterfully set at. I will secure a hotel or transport to another city," Adrian offers casually. "I will provide untraceable currency and fabricated identification to help you disappear." A sudden surge of dopamine floods her system. "Really?" she breathes. He moves toward the exit, pausing deliberately for psychological effect. "But if you flee, Ethan will track you. He has the resources, and the syndicate ensures his security. You will spend days in paranoid flight until he catches you." The hope dies in her eyes. Or, Adrian continues, laying the dark foundation for a trauma bond. "You stay in my facility. You heal. And when you reach optimal capacity, you determine how to handle the man who tried to erase your existence." Leia processes the strategic variables. "Why would you protect me?" "Because Ethan committed a fatal error," Adrian replies coldly. He believed he could use against my empire and walk away. I do not let miscalculations go unpunished.
He shares as him.
So, I am simply bait for your agenda now. A flicker of dark amusement crosses his shadowed features. No, you are a choice. What do you extract from this? She demands, ignoring her screaming ribs to stand up. Adrian studies her trembling frame. I gain the profound satisfaction of watching Ethan Vance realize he's discarded the only piece on the board that possessed true value. He exits the room. For the first time in 6 long years of domestic imprisonment, a dangerous predator has formally offered her true agency. You and I have faced hard choices, but watch how her mind justifies this one. The days blur as Leia runs a desperate risk assessment. She chooses captivity, not because she trusts Adrian. Trusting a kingpin is a dangerous cognitive distortion, but because the alternative guarantees an early grave. Constant flight requires unsustainable cortisol levels. Staying grants us space to build a survival strategy. Slowly, Margaret transitions from a silent warden to a cautious confidant. While changing Leia's bandages, she reveals she has served Adrian for 12 years. Before that, she was tethered to a violently abusive partner. The life lesson here is incredibly dark, yet undeniable. Sometimes, in a broken world, true salvation arrives wearing the face of a terrifying monster. Mr. Romano presented an escape route. Margaret explained the gauze. Securing, he rarely intervenes, but when he does, his ownership is absolute. No one touches what belongs to him. Leia feels a reflexive rejection. I do not belong to him, she asserts. Margaret offers a micro-expression of sad resignation. Not yet. That phrase plants a seed of profound psychological unrest in Leia's mind. Adrian's visits become sporadic. He materializes at unpredictable intervals, maintaining dominance through intermittent reinforcement. He checks her metrics and vanishes like a drop in atmospheric pressure. On the 10th day of isolation, the established behavioral pattern shatters. The heavy door opens and Adrian steps inside with an unknown male companion. Adrian strides into the room, followed by a man carrying a medical bag. The newcomer presents a harming demeanor, introducing himself as Dr. Cartellano. I require a full medical evaluation, Adrian commands. Ensure no damage was overlooked. Leia's defense mechanisms activate instantly. I am functioning fine, she insists. You were subjected to near-lethal blunt force trauma. Adrian counters, his face a mask of flat affect. You are not fine. Submit to the examination. She feels the desperate urge to resist, but she recognizes the tragic normalization of her own chronic pain. She silently yields. Dr. Castellano proceeds with a methodical, neurological, and physical assessment, documenting her vitals and reflexes in a small leather journal. You and I must examine how identity functions in trauma victims. The doctor gives his summary. 3 fractured ribs, stabilizing, contusions resolving, no internal hemorrhaging, responses normative. You survived against significant odds, Mrs. Vance. Leia experiences a sharp physiological recoil at the surname. Do not refer to me by that title, she instructs in a low register. The physician exhibits confusion before Adrian asserts his dominance over the interaction. She has discarded that identity, he states sharply. Castellano quickly recalibrates and apologizes. After he is dismissed, Leia challenges Adrian's presumption. I remain legally bound to him, she says. Adrian meets her gaze, the lightings casting his face in shadow. Not for much longer, he replies calmly. Is cutting through the dim room. Used your fake kidnapping to play the grieving husband, swapping his tech for their smuggling routes. Leia's breath caught, her hand gripping her gown. He is moving forward, she whispered. He already did, Adrian replied. He replaced you with a younger assistant. The sheer speed of her erasure hit Leia like a physical blow. I need to see him, she demanded, her voice shaking with panic. Adrian blocked the door. Absolutely not, he commanded. He only sees people as tools. He will use your pain all over again to build his perfect public mask. Sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is refuse to look back at the fire that almost burned us to ashes.
Stay with me on this one, because this is where the Broken try to take back their story. I am not asking for permission, Leia snapped. Her voice was steel, even as her fingers trembled against the sheets.
I must look him in the eye, and the icons that survived. Adrian crossed the floor, using his tall frame to block the exit. And then what? He challenged. He laughs at you, and you fall apart? Then I fall apart, she fired back. But it will be my own choice. Adrian studied the desperate defiance carved into her pale face. You do not have the armor for this as yet, he murmured. She did not flinch.
With a heavy sigh, he pulled out his phone, tapped at the glass, and turned the glowing screen toward her. The hardest choices in life are always the ones we must own entirely.
Let us look at the invisible chains of trauma together. On the screen, Leia watched Ethan, the man who nearly destroyed her, smiling at a gala holding the waist of a new girl. The air left Leia's lungs in a rush. Her chest caved in as the sick reality washed over her. Adrian watched her break, applying just enough cold truth to anchor her. He threw you away, he stated simply. When Leia's hands curled into fists, desperate to run out and scream at the man who ruined her, Adrian took a deliberate step backward. He gave her nothing to fight against. He forced her to find her own footing, quietly rewiring her broken instincts. The lesson here is painful but necessary. Holding onto the very source of your suffering only guarantees your wounds will never truly close. Adrian walked out, pulling the heavy door shut and leaving her in total isolation. The click of the lock sent Leia spinning into a silent panic. For 6 years, her entire soul was built on waiting for Ethan's next violent explosion. Without that constant terror, her mind had no idea how to function. The silence grew deafening until something dark and primal clawed its way out of the emptiness. By the time morning sun crept through the blinds, her body vibrated with fierce, angry energy. She dropped to the cold floor, forcing her weak muscles through punishing push-ups, desperate to feel in control of her own flesh again. Sometimes, the most terrifying truth a survivor faces is that the soft person they used to be is dead, replaced entirely by someone built for war. The rage burning inside her was just a heavy cloaked blade, hiding the crushing grief of being thrown away so easily. Leia paced the shadowed hallways of the compound, her bare feet slapping the concrete as she searched for something real to hold on to. She pushed through double doors and froze inside a massive combat room. Floor-to-ceiling mirrors threw the harsh light back at her, while thick leather bags hung from steel chains. Leia stared at her reflection like she was looking at a ghost. She saw a hollow, bruised woman, her skin painted in the ugly colors of abuse. Slowly, her trembling hand reached out and pressed against the rough leather of the heavy bag. Healing does not start when a room finally feels safe. It begins the exact second you decide to strike back at the silence. Watch how the atmosphere shifts when Marcus steps into the room. His sudden voice made Leia jump violently, her body reacting to the phantom ghosts of her past. Marcus was an imposing man, his jaw lined with deep silver scars, but his dark eyes watched toward her with calm patience instead of malice. Instantly, Leia raised her chin, crossing her arms defensively over her bruised ribs. She spat out a quick excuse, desperate to pound her fists against the leather to drown out the screaming in her mind. Marcus slowly shook his head, refusing to let her tear her own body apart in the name of therapy. "You are done hurting yourself," he told her gently. "True recovery takes immense grueling patience. You simply cannot outrun your nightmares by punishing the very body that just barely survived them. I did everything right and he still broke my bones," Leia yelled, raw defiance pouring out of her like blood from a wound. She was completely done being compliant. Marcus did not offer her empty platitudes. He looked at her battered face and bluntly agreed that she had been beaten half to death. Hearing a stranger speak of her darkest secret so casually made Leia's stomach drop. The awful realization that these men knew every detail of her humiliation made her feel naked in the harsh light. Yet, instead of pitying her, Marcus pointed a scarred finger toward the center of the padded mat. He was giving her a safe place to pour out the fire. Our pain always demands a witness, but far more importantly, it requires a disciplined outlet before it completely burns the vessel, holding it to ash. Marcus saw right through her. He knew she had no emotional armor left, so he offered to build her a physical one. Watch her best speed onto the mat. It is the first choice she has made in years. For an agonizing hour, Marcus broke down her flinching reflexes. He tore the panicked freeze response Ethan had beaten into her. When the session ended, Leia's muscles screamed in agony, but as she wiped the sweat from her brow, a faint spark flickered in her eyes. This pain was different. This pain belonged to her. It was not a punishment from a cruel husband, but a fire she had walked into willingly. The hardest lesson we ever learn is this: choosing your own suffering is the very first step toward reclaiming your ultimate freedom. The grueling session ended with Marcus giving her strict daily schedule, providing her chaotic mind a much needed anchor. When Leia gasped for breath and asked why he cared, Marcus looked away. "Adrian ordered it," he muttered, though the haunted look in his eyes hinted at his own buried nightmares. Leia watched the rigid set of his shoulders, recognizing the posture of someone who just as always became a monster, but just to survive one. 2 floors above, Adrian watched the entire session on a glowing monitor, his face an unreadable mask of calculation. Beside him, Dante scoffed at her frantic punching, calling it pure manic desperation. But empathy hides in strange places. Often, those who have clawed their way out of the darkest abyss are the only ones capable of guiding someone else back to the light. In the surveillance room, Dante argued for pragmatism, while Adrian played the calculating architect. "Let her rest," Dante insisted. But Adrian knew that leaving a traumatized mind in a quiet room only breeds madness. "She needs a war to fight," Adrian countered softly, "or she will shatter completely." Outside these walls, the Underworld was already whispering. Rival families assumed Adrian only saved the battered woman for leverage. Worse, Ethan had taken to the blights of the media. The arrogant husband was weeping on television, claiming Adrian had kidnapped his beloved wife, spinning his own ink crimes into a tragic, it is a timeless, sickening truth of humanity. The cruelest abusers will always play the bleeding victim the exact second they finally lose control over you. Stick with me here, because this is where the game turns deadly. Ethan did not want his wife back. His public tears were just a shiny excuse to hunt down his enemies. Dante saw the storm coming and demanded they throw Leia out to the wolves to save their empire. "Cut the dead weight," he urged, but Adrian stood still, refusing the logical choice. Dante stared at his boss, bewildered by this crack of mercy in a man famous for having a heart of stone. On the grainy screen, Adrian watched Leia stumble to her knees, spit blood, and slowly force herself back to her feet. Without realizing it, Adrian let out a breath, a strange tight feeling seizing his chest. The human soul cannot be entirely buried. Even the most ruthless men cannot help but bow to a survivor's sheer, unbreakable will. Adrian tried to lie to himself. He told Dante that keeping the girl was strictly business, a perfect weapon to destroy Ethan's arrogant empire. Dante saw right through the hollow excuse. If you use her pain to win a war, you are no better than the husband who beat her. Dante challenged softly. The words hit their mark. Adrian's jaw locked, his large hands curling into tight fists at his sides as the weight of his own hypocrisy sank in. Down below, 2 weeks of sweat and isolation were finally clearing the heavy fog from Leia's traumatized brain. She cornered a quiet maid named Margaret, her sharp eyes demanding real answers about this gilded cage. A mind crawling out of the darkness will always reach a point where it demands the brutal truth, no matter how terribly that truth might sting. Let us step into the room and watch this unfold together, shall we? The air is thick, suffocating. Leia stands rigid, her spine perfectly straight as she tries to build a fortress out of morality. She demands Margaret explain why she protects a monster like Adrian. But Margaret does not flinch. The older woman simply tilts her head, her voice dropping to a whisper as she turns the mirror around. She asks Leia to look at her own husband, Ethan, and the pristine corporate violence he commits every day. The defense shatters instantly. You can see the exact second Leia's eyes widen, the realization pulling the breath from her lungs. We spend so much energy judging the shadows in others, forgetting that a clean, tailored suit is often the most dangerous disguise a monster can wear. The camera would linger here, capturing the blue, ghostly moonlight playing across Leia's bed. She is completely unraveling. Sleep refuses to come. Her mind loops the violence, playing the moment Ethan's fist met bone, over and over in the deafening silence of her room. The bruises fading on her skin are no longer just injuries. They are heavy, undeniable proof of the man he truly is. She cannot call it just another stressful day at the office anymore. The cold truth strips away every excuse she ever invented for him. Gasping for air, she throws the heavy blankets aside and flees the room, desperate to escape her own mind. Facing the ugly truth about someone you love will break your heart into pieces, but it is the only way to ever truly heal. She drifts the sleeping estate like a ghost haunting her own life. The heavy oak doors groan as she pushes into the library, a sprawling cavern of leather and paper. The moonlight catches dust motes dancing in the air. She runs a trembling finger along the perfectly aligned spines of the books, searching for something real to hold on to. Then comes the sharp clink of ice against crystal. She freezes. There, seated deep in the velvet shadows, is Adrian. He holds a glass of amber whiskey, his eye tracking her every move. He does not yell. He does not posture. He just sits in the quiet dark, letting the gravity of his presence pull her in. Real strength never has to shout to be heard. It simply waits for you to realize it was there all along. You and I have probably seen this exact trap spring shot before. Adrian leans forward, the harsh lines of his face softening into a mask of deep bone-aching exhaustion. He tells her she can stay, offering a warmth that makes her cry out her heavy, carrying shame. When she confesses her blindness to Ethan's cruelty, Adrian does not mock her. Instead, his voice is velvet, explaining how men like her husband build entire worlds just to trap you. But Leia is waking up. She wipes a tear, her chin trembling, and asks if he is doing the exact same thing right now. A slow, chilling smile touches his lips as he nods and says yes. Sometimes The most terrifying lies we fall for are the ones wrapped in absolute, brutal honesty. The dim glow of the library casts long, jagged shadows across Adrian's face as Leia stands facing her ground. She demands to know his real game. He swirls his drink, the ice clinking loudly in the quiet room, and tells her the flat truth. He is using her. He wants to tear her husband down piece by piece, and she is the perfect crowbar. It is a masterful stroke of manipulation. By admitting he sees her as a pawn, ironically makes her feel safe. When she spits out that it's nothing but a stray dog to him, he stands up, leaning in close enough for her to feel the heat of him, and praises the wild fight burning in her eyes. It is a hard pill to swallow, but the people who tell us exactly how they will use us are the hardest ones to walk away from. The air between them crackles with thick electric tension. Adrian slowly walks circles around her, his eyes taking in the sharp hitch of her breath as she guards her broken ribs. He strips away her armor with slow, deliberate words, whispering that she is terrified of being caged, yet entirely paralyzed by the thought of being left all alone. Her hands ball into fists. She begs him down to bolt off the heavy gates and let her walk. He refuses, his voice dropping an octave as he reminds her that her husband is waiting out there with a loaded gun. The cold reality settles deep into her bones, locking her feet to the floor. We often confuse a smaller cage for freedom simply because the monster outside the bars has sharper teeth. He watches her, merely reading the frantic beating of her heart in the pulse at her throat. When she screams that she is no one's property, the sound echoes off the high, dark walls. Adrian steps, intimately close, reaching out to gently brush a stray lock of hair from her tear-stained cheek. He softly promises he only wants her breathing. Leia stares back, her voice hollow, as she whispers that in his world, survival and ownership are the exact same thing. Cut to 3 days later. The heavy thud of fists against leather fills the gym as Leia punishes the heavy bag. A nervous guard rushes in. Adrian wants her. The invisible chain pulls tight. We fight so hard to prove we are free, only to realize the leash was just resting in someone else's hand. Come with me down this long, suffocating hallway. You can feel the heavy dread sinkings like a stone in Leia's stomach. Every step she takes through the massive, winding estate is a reminder of her own helplessness. 2 armed guards push open the towering double doors, throwing her into a cold, glass-walled office that look out over the grounds like an empire. Adrian does not even turn around. He stands at the window, barking ruthless commands into his phone, letting the heavy silence of his ignored guest fill the room. He wants her to feel tiny, to feel the crushing weight of the power he holds in this house. People will always show you how small they think you are before they ever ask for your surrender. Adrian drops the phone and turns slowly. With a barely visible flick of his chest, the heavy doors slam shut behind her. The lock clicks, echoing like a gunshot. He moves around the dark wood desk, his face completely empty, forcing Leia to drown in her own racing panic. He fires a sharp question about her husband's offshore accounts. She stumbles backward, stuttering out blind guesses about patents and clean money. Then he drops the name of a hidden bleeding-edge project. Her knees practically give out. A scarred enforcer slides a massive, damning file across the smooth glass desk. The paper spills out, stained with undeniable proof. The darkest secrets are almost always hiding right beside us, sleeping quietly in our own beds until they wake up to destroy us. The bright fluorescent light beats down as Leia's trembling fingers trace the black ink on the pages. Words like surveillance and offshore accounts blur together. Adrian stands over her shoulder, his voice a low, steady hum, explaining How her husband dressed up to dirty, violent money in a pressed corporate suit. He maps out the rotten roots of the criminal syndicate. When she finally backs back a sob and asks how he found all this, his eyes go dead cold. He tells her that a man only beats his wife half to death if he is terrified she knows too much. He simply followed her blood back to the money. It is a sickening truth to face. Greed will turn a blind eye to any horror, as long as the check clears at the end of the day. The room begins to spin wildly around her. She grips the edge of the glass desk to stop from falling as Adrian delivers the final crushing blow. He looks her dead in the eye and tells her the beating was never about anger. It was just a clean corporate write-off. She was a loose end, a liability. The camera pushes in on her face as the last 10 years of her life turn to ash. The sweet anniversaries, the gentle smiles, it was all a stage play. She whispers to the empty room, it never did anything wrong. Adrian places a heavy, grounding hand, confirming her truth, before telling her that exposing this will burn down half the city. Underworld. The deepest betrayals never come from our enemies, but from the ones who promise to keep us safe. We have reached the edge of the cliff now. Adrian leans down, whispering the brutal, bloody cost of what comes next. If they pull this trigger, the syndicate will come for them with everything they have. Leia looks up, tears gone, her eyes hard as flint, and snarls that she does not care. He backs her into the wall, demanding she say out loud to the man who broke her. Her chest heaves, the adrenaline mixing with pure, unadulterated hatred. Her voice shakes the room as she begs for Ethan to feel every single ounce of the pain he caused her. A dark, terrifying smile spreads across Adrian's face. True vengeance never leaves you clean. It always demands a piece of your own soul as payment. The camera pans over the dimly lit room, settling on Adrian. His voice is a low rumble, outlining a slow, agonizing demolition of Ethan's empire. Designer, strip everything but the man's breath. Leia sits across from him, her hands trembling violently in her lap, a storm of pure rage brewing beneath her delicate skin. She refuses this slow, silent path. She demands the visceral release of facing her tormentor, to look into the abyss that nearly swallowed her. You and I have probably both made this tragic mistake. Believing that looking the devil in the eye will somehow extinguish his flames, when in truth it only invites the fire to burn us further. Adrian's jaw tightens, the faint shift of bone illuminated by the stark overhead light, furious that his absolute authority has been challenged. A silent, suffocating tension chokes the room until Liz steps from the shadows, his voice a gravelly murmur of agreement. He argues that letting a monster sleep only makes him deadlier. Adrian's gaze slices toward Leia, warning her of the fatal crosshairs she now paints upon her own chest. But she holds his stare, transforming from a shattered victim into an unyielding combatant. The prey has finally bared her teeth. We often forget in our own lives that true survival sometimes requires to be forced willingly into the line of fire. The camera lingers on the sleek black fabric of Leia's gown as the armored sedan glides through the rain-slicked streets. She is a weapon forged from a shattered wife. Her reflection in the glass distantly betraying a hardened core stripped of all innocence. Beside her, Adrian sits completely motionless, an obsidian statue of calculated violence anchoring her to this dangerous new reality. His voice cuts the heavy air, a sterile hum explaining the trap they have set beneath the blinding glare of restaurant chandeliers, a masterpiece of environmental control. Sometimes, you and I must wear the heavy armor of our darkest past to truly find the strength to walk away from it forever. Adrian promises lethal force to her abuser, with the casual indifference of reading a weather report. Yet, beneath the luxurious folds of her dress, Leia's hands tremble wildly, her entire nervous system humming with sheer, unadulterated terror. She presses them down hard against her thighs, firmly rejecting the final escape Adrian offers at the heavy oak doors. Inside, the lighting is a bruised cinematic violet. Ethan sits at the far table, the very picture of tailored elegance, casually swirling his wine. He does not flinch as she approaches, viewing her merely as a broken toy. We must always remember that true monsters rarely hide in the dark. They sit comfortably in the finest light. Ethan smiles, a thin, lifeless upward curve of his lips, and remarks that she looks radiant. The sheer audacity of his greeting wraps around Leia's throat like a physical wire, choking the breath from her lungs. Adrian's hand rests on her spine for a fraction of a second, a silent anchor in a raging sea, before he melts into the shadows by the door. Leia forces the air down, her voice unnervingly steady as she confronts the man who tried to end her. He merely takes another sip of his deep red wine, sighing that her survival is terribly inconvenient. A problematic variable in his grand design is a harsh truth we all eventually face. The people who break us rarely see themselves as the villain. The clinking of silver against porcelain rings out loudly as Ethan casually writes off a brutalized body as a simple matter of accounting. He could not afford her questions, he murmurs, his eyes utterly devoid of the man she once loved. Leia's nails carve deep crescents into her own palms, the sharp pain grounding her fractured mind as Ethan dismisses her as an expired asset, mocking the illusion of rescue. Stick with me here, because this is where the tragedy deepens. He glances at Adrian, assuming the rival is only there to claim territory and watch her mentally shatter. Predators always assume the rest of the world operates with the exact same cold, calculating malice that they do. The camera shifts to Ethan's calculating eyes, waiting for the inevitable collapse. He expects this desperate tears, the familiar, tragic symphonies of a broken orchestra he so meticulously orchestrated, but the weeping never comes. Instead, Leia leans across the stark white tablecloth, the heavy shadows contouring the sharp, unyielding angles of her face. She leans into the danger, whispering that she has absolutely nothing left for him to take. You and I must recognize this undeniable shift in the human spirit. When a victim finally stops fearing the fire that burned them, they become the very inferno the abuser cannot control. The ultimate power in this life is simply the absence of fear. A microscopic twitch betrays the absolute stillness of Ethan's face. It is not terror, but the chilling realization that his puppet has permanently cut her own strings. He rises, smoothing his expensive jacket, and delivers a quiet, venomous promise of death to Adrian before disappearing into the evening rain. Instantly, the invisible scaffolding holding Leia upright shatters. The walls of the restaurant seem to blur and crush inward, her chest heaving as the adrenaline aggressively drains from her veins. Adrian's hand finds her shoulder, exalted and unmoving, and she lets him guide her away. Even the strongest warriors must eventually allow themselves to be held when the battle ends. The heavy steel doors of the escape vehicle to seal shut, and the dam finally breaks. Violent tremors rack Leia's slender frame, the sheer physical toll of survival flooding her exhausted nervous system. Adrian watches her in the dim streetlights passing by, his low voice cutting through the dark to remind her that panicked men erratic miscs. Yet she stares out the rain-streaked window, watching ordinary citizens walking under umbrellas, completely oblivious to the shadow war raging in the streets. It is the most isolating tragedy of surviving deep, trauma. We walk among the living, carrying a heavy, invisible ghost story that no one else can see, hear, or even begin to understand. The bloody consequence of her bravery arrives in the dead, suffocating silence of 3 in the morning. Leia lies staring at the ceiling, the phantom image of Ethan's dead eyes playing on a continuous loop in her mind. Suddenly, the heavy bedroom door splinters inward with a violent crash. Adrian fills the doorframe, bathed in the sickly yellow hall light. He is a terrifying monument of controlled rage, his voice a flat, deadpan hum as he announces the slaughter of 4 of his best men. Let us pause and look at this moment together. True terror is not found in a screaming, unpredictable man, but in one who has silenced his humanity completely to prepare for an absolute bloodbath.
The words hit her chest like a physical blow. The syndicate left her name in the wreckage. This wave of vertigo, sending Leia crashing to the hardwood floor.
Her hands scrambling against the grain as panic paralyzes her limbs. She chokes on the agonizing guilt. The nurse, a desperate need for closure has doomed them all. But Adrian kneels, his massive frame blocking the chaotic shadows of the hallway, and forces her to look at him. He dismantles her guilt with cold, surgical precision. The narcissist is merely weaponizing her existence. We must never carry the heavy burden of the crimes committed by those who only seek to manipulate and destroy us. The camera follows them down the sweeping staircase into a sprawling mansion consumed by organized, militaristic chaos. Heavily armed men rack weaponry in the shadows, their movements sharp and lethal beneath the flickering chandelier. Dante shouts a sequence of harsh tactical commands, shoving a thick wool coat against Leia's trembling chest. In seconds, they are swallowed by the armored belly of an escape vehicle, the tires screaming against the wet asphalt. Leia's world narrows to the deafening thunder of her own heartbeat, while Adrian sits in the absolute dark, casually outlining his plan to speak with the devil himself. Sometimes the only way out of hell is to walk directly into the fire. The camera pushes in on Adrian, his face half hidden in the dim light. His goal is to build an unbreakable fortress around Leia, even if it means inviting a bloodbath. Dante paces the floor, his voice tight with the cold logic of their disadvantage. But Adrian does not flinch. His expression remains carved from stone. He has a bargaining chip, and he drops the name like a heavy coin. Ethan Vance. Leia's breath catches in her throat. She stares at Adrian, realizing he is trading a human life to buy her freedom. It is a desperate wager, banking entirely on the syndicate's greed. Adrian turns slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. If this fails, they will vanish. The truth is simple. Sometimes the only way to escape darkness is to become invisible to it. The crushing weight of the moment wraps around Leia's shoulders like a shroud. The impending violence and sudden exile all flow from her need to confront her past. A whispered apology slips from her lips, torn out by a profound sense of blame. Adrian, usually as unreadable as winter frost, softens just a fraction. He does not dismiss her pain, but gently commands her to step aside so he can build their defenses. The scene cuts to a hidden penthouse, a cold cage of glass and steel entirely stripped of warmth. As armed men sweep the shadows, Leia stands frozen in the center of the floor. She wraps her arms tightly around her own ribs, trying to hold herself together. Guilt, after all, is a much heavier cage than any physical prison. The syndicate demands a meeting on their waterfront territory. Is a beautifully constructed trap. Adrian understands the twisted mechanics of this world than anyone. You and I can see the brutal reality here. Refusing is a fatal admission of fear. For the first time, his impenetrable armor cracks. Adrian exhales sharply, raking a trembling hand through his dark hair. They are vastly outnumbered, walking into a slaughterhouse. Leia begs him to ignore the bait, to send a proxy in his place. But the underworld runs on toxic pride. Sending a subordinate is a devastating insult, one that demands a river of blood in return. Pride always collects a fatal toll. Adrian's voice is low, resonant, with the grim certainty of a man reading a death sentence. An insult guarantees casualties, yet walking into an ambush promises the exact same grave. Driven by a deeply rooted martyr complex, Leia offers her own life. She will surrender to buy his safety. The silence in the room becomes deafening. Adrian's rejection is sharp as a blade. He tears her logic apart. The cartel would simply use her body to lure him into the crosshairs, discarding her the second he fell. When she questions his obsessive need to protect her, he closes the distance in 3 fierce strides. He forces her to look deep into the eyes of a wounded predator. We only fight this hard for the things we cannot bear to lose. He refuses to let her burn on his altar. The light catches his fierce devotion as tells her she is meant for a Belial life beyond this damage. Leia's voice shakes, demanding to know why he values his own breathing so little, so little compared to hers. For a suffocating moment, the camera lingers on Adrian's in silence. He finally steps back. His answer is a quiet tragedy. She still has the light inside her to build a real life. He believes his own soul is permanently stained, beyond any hope of repair. But before his confession can settle, his phone vibrates. The room holds its breath. As he listens to the voice on the other end, the color drains completely from his face. True loss never announces itself loudly. The unsaid words hang in the sterile air. Thick and poisonous, Ethan is dead. The news hour strikes Leia like a blow, her knees giving out as she grips a chair just to stay standing. The details are grim. A single gunshot to the head, carefully arranged to look like a desperate suicide. Dante immediately spits out the name of the Viscaris. Adrian's mind races, his eyes calculating the fallout. Their one bargaining chip is gone. Ethan's murder was a brutal erasing of loose ends. Slay. Les stares at the floor, asking why they would do it. The answer is the oldest rule of survival in the dark. A silenced man can never point a finger. There is no loyalty among wolves, only the primal hunger to survive. With Ethan dead, the Syndicate's secrets are washed clean forever. Adrian cancels the meeting without hesitation. The chess match is over. The enemy is now solely focused on slaughter. Leia collapses into her seat. The man who tore her life apart is gone, yet the rush of relief she imagined is nowhere to be found. The camera focuses on her hollow expression. Instead of joy, there is only a vast emptiness. Adrian watches her shatter. Her voice cracks as she whispers that she just wanted him to answer for his sins. But Adrian's reply is laced with the bitter truth of the dark world he leads. Real justice rarely heals the heart. Sometimes the end of a monster leaves nothing but a cold, empty room. This is not an ending. It is the turning of a bloodier wheel. Adrian sinks low, bringing his eyes level with hers, and lets the mask slip. He confesses his absolute exhaustion, a deep hatred for the venomous world he rules. It is a stunning moment of vulnerability, his armor falling away. When she asks how he keeps going, his eyes betray a terrifying truth. His flawless control is finally crumbling. He is losing his grip. The air is breathless until the heavy glass explodes inward. Survival demands pure instinct. Before Leia can scream, Adrian lunges, throwing his entire weight over her as a relentless storm of bullets rips through the twilight. Love is proven in the darkest seconds. Let's look at this frame. The camera slows to a crawl as paralysis takes hold of Leia. The roar of weapons shredding the walls fades into a muffled heartbeat. She cannot draw breath. She is completely immobilized, dragged across the shattered glass by Adrian's unyielding grip. Adrian is terrifyingly calm, slipping into the cold machinery of war. He shoves her into Dante's waiting arms. As Dante racks the slide of his weapon, his eyes narrowed with the detachment of a soldier. Adrian looks at her, ordering her to run and never look back. He is choosing to stay behind, offering himself as the final barricade. Leia clings to him, refusing to let go. Hardship does not create character. It merely strips away the lies, revealing the raw truth beneath. Notice the absolute finality in his posture. Adrian cuts through her panic, declaring in a voice of iron that this is not up for debate. It is the command of a man who demands total obedience. Yet his eyes hold a tragic softness. That single agonizing glance breaks her heart. He apologizes not just for the raining glass, but for the dark world he dragged her into. He plunges back into the gunfire. Leia drops to her knees, slamming her palms over her ears as time stretches into eternity. The heavy door splinters. Dante bursts through, bleeding and breathless, operating on pure adrenaline. He hauls her up, pulling her past the fallen. She squeezes her eyes shut. Sometimes surviving the nightmare means refusing to stare into its eyes. The camera tracks them into the hallway. The biting smell of burning powder hangs in the air. Dante hammers the elevator button. The doors slide open. Freedom is inches away. But suddenly, Leia's gaze snaps back toward the ruin of the penthouse. This is the tragic poetry of a deeply scarred heart, rejecting the safety she fought to find. She tears herself away from Dante and sprints back into the blinding gray smoke. She cannot see the shooters. She moves blindly toward the sound of death, screaming his name until her throat bleeds. It defies all rational thought, but grief has no use for reason. She rounds a shattered pillar and nearly stumbles over a crumpled shape on the floor. It is a harsh truth. We frequently mistake our heaviest chains for our only source of safety. The invincible king has fallen. Adrian sits slumped against the ruined plaster, a fatal crimson pool spreading rapidly beneath his ribs. His gun clicks empty. The terrifying composure that defined him is gone, replaced by a pale sweat. He orders her to run, but the words are barely a ragged whisper. Leia crashes to her knees beside him. Without a second thought, she buries her trembling hands into the hot, rushing tide of his blood, fighting a desperate war against time. Dante charges into the smoke, swearing violently, and together they haul the dying weight of this man toward the descending elevator. You and I must remember this final image. Absolute power is nothing but a fragile illusion. It bleeds out onto the floor, just like anything else, the moment the skin is pierced. The elevator doors slam shut, sealing them in a descending cage and muting the gunfire above. The silence is deafening. Adrian's head lolls against Leia's shoulder, his breathing dangerously shallow. She pulls him closer, her voice trembling as she begs him to stay awake. He murmurs that she should have left him. She shakes her head with unbreakable defiance, whispering that she doesn't leave people behind.
Right, she is rewriting her own tragic story, tying her fur to a criminal.
The doors open to an idling car. They drag his heavy body into the back seat, and Leia throws her entire weight against his open wound to slow the bleeding. It brings us to a harsh but simple truth. We only discover who we really are when we are forced to bleed for someone else. The car tears down the street, turning city lights into a blur. Leia stares at the man bleeding to death in her lap. His chest jerks unevenly, signaling his body is shutting down. Desperate for control, she demands to know their destination. Dante stays quiet. Leia presses her blood-soaked hands harder against Adrian's torn flesh. You and I have probably seen this kind of desperate bargaining before. She acts as if her physical strength alone can keep his soul inside his body, begging him not to save her, just to die now. Slowly, Adrian reaches out. His trembling fingers find hers in the dark. Gripping tight, it leaves us with the simple truth. How isolated we feel in life, we will always instinctively reach out for human connection right before the dark finally closes in. Adrian is drowning in his own blood, yet he forces out one last command. He tells Leia to take his hidden money, change her name, and disappear, even at the edge of the grave. He tries to control her survival. When Leia cries out, asking why he even cares, his answer shatters his hardened shell. He whispers, she is the only thing he has done right in 10 long years.
Is this real remorse or just a broken man trying to buy his own redemption? He passes out before she can reply. Up front, call lead announces they are 20 minutes away. Leia's left in the dark,
whispering softly to a violent, impossible man. It highlights a heartbreaking reality. People will spend their entire lives fighting through hell, just searching for one single moment of pure absolution. Watch her face closely, because this is the moment that everything shifts. Over the last few weeks, this man stopped being her captor. He became the only person who actually saw her. She isn't just scared he will die. She is terrified of losing her only anchor. The car skids to a halt at an isolated cabin where a numb underground doctor rushes out to help. When the doctor drags Adrian's inside and slams the heavy door in Leia's face as Threaterine hits her like a physical blow, she stands frozen in the dim hallway, shaking violently with adrenaline, her clothes completely soaked in his blood. She is trapped in a nightmare loop, replaying his pale, dying face. It teaches us a brutal lesson. Surviving the physical violence is often much easier than surviving the suffocating, empty quiet of the aftermath. Dante steps out of the shadows and hands her a clean towel. It is a small gesture, an attempt to wipe away the visible horror. Begins scrubbing her stained arms like a machine, her eyes completely blank. She immediately starts blaming herself, whispering that her actions with Ethan and the Viscaris family caused this. Dante refuses to let her spiral. He grabs her shoulders, forcing her to look him in the eye, and fiercely insists that Adrian is simply too stubborn to die. He warns her to brace herself for the hell that is coming next. Dante knows exactly how their dark world operates. There is a deep, hard truth buried here. Guilt is a completely useless emotion when you are trying to survive. It only drains the precious energy you need just to keep breathing till tomorrow. Let's look at this together, shall we? The sheer agony of waiting completely breaks a person down. Leia collapses onto the floor, her nerves entirely fried. The hours drag by in silence. When the morning sun bleeds through the window, it brings no comfort, only lighting up the blood on her hands. Eventually, the exhausted doctor steps into the hall, quietly announcing he is stable for now. Leia's legs is nearly give out from the sudden relief. She pushes into the dim bedroom, and the sight steals her breath. This untouchable, terrifying man is now just a fragile, broken thing on a narrow bed. His chest is wrapped in bandages, an IV taped to his arm. It is a humbling life lesson. No matter how much power or fear a person commands, we are all just fragile flesh and bone, waiting for the day we finally break. Leia drags a chair to his bedside. She gently takes his cold hand, terrified she might hurt him more. Staring at his pale face, she whispers, "He is an idiot for thinking he was invincible." That sharp scolding is just a desperate release valve for her crushing fear. Her anger fades, and she breaks down. She buries her face against his skin, weeping, begging him to wake up. While she cries in the quiet dark, the The world outside is burning. Dante is pacing the living room, managing the fallout. Ethan is dead, and the Viscaris family has triggered a bloody turf war, tearing the city apart. Two different kinds of chaos colliding in one tiny cabin. It proves that true terror rarely comes from the war raging outside our walls. It comes from the quiet realization of what we's to lose inside our own hearts. Think about this profound shift with me. For 6 brutal years, Leia was married to Ethan, a man who trained her to be quiet and submissive. But sitting beside a criminal like Adrian, she feels an emotional fire she has never experienced. It is a fierce, violent loyalty. It is the dark pull that makes someone run back into a burning building to save the person who held them hostage. It changes the foundation of who she is. Suddenly, Adrian's fingers twitch, his heavy eyelids flutter open, his eyes darting around the room, hunting for threats. Leia leans in close, her voice soft, trying to calm his racing mind. The life lesson here is sharp and undeniable. Extreme trauma does not merely break us down into pieces. It completely rewires who we are fundamentally capable of becoming. Adrian's first conscious thought cuts straight through the pain. His voice is a broken rasp as he reminds her that he ordered her to leave. Leia doesn't blink. She leans closer, quietly repeating her new rule. She does not leave people behind. For a split second, the ghost of a smile tugs at his mouth, a tiny, tragic moment of validation before his exhausted body drags him back into sleep. But that relief doesn't last. Dante's dark frame fills the doorway, bringing the freezing reality of their world right back. The Viscaris crime family just dropped a $2 million bounty on their heads. Dante offers 2 options: pack up and run, or turn around and kill the threat. It reminds us that safety is always a fragile illusion. The very second you finally stop running is the exact moment that monsters catch your scent. Leia turns to look at Dante, the cold man who dragged her from the shadows. He calmly lays out a plan of pure aggression. They must hunt down the Viscaris leaders and make the price of chasing them written in blood. It is a suicide mission, but Dante swears it is their only way out. Watch her body language here. Her trembling hands slowly curl into tight fists. Her mind flashes through the horrors: her dead husband, the blood in the hallway, Adrian bleeding out, and the terrified wife she used to be. That old version of Leia is dead. She lifts her chin, completely embracing the darkness of this violent world, and coldly asks Dante for her orders. It leaves us with a chilling life lesson. Sometimes the absolute only way to defeat the terrifying monsters in the dark is to step into the shadows and become one yourself. Look closely at Dante's reaction. His pupils dilate, a rare split-second crack in his icy mask. This soft civilian woman is standing before him, demanding to be trained for a bloodbath. Most would call this bravery, but it is actually a massive trauma response. She is rejecting the role of the helpless victim, clawing desperately for control in a nightmare. Dante stares at her, silently weighing her fragile mental state before he finally nods. But he sets a brutal condition. She must obey his every command without question. The clock is ticking fast. She has exactly 48 hours to tear down everything she believes about and right, wrong. 48 hours to take a woman and hammer her shattered killer. The life lesson is grim but true. Sheer survival often forces us to forge deadly weapons out of our own broken pieces. Stick with me. This is where the human mind gets truly terrifying. It takes less than 2 days for a person to throw away their moral compass when survival is all that is left. Leia isn't looking for justice anymore. Her brain has locked her trauma in a dark box, replacing her fear with a burning need for violence. Worrying about right and wrong is a luxury she can't afford. The lack of sleep pushes her further over the edge. Every time she blinks, she sees shattered glass and feels Adrian's blood on her hands. Long before the sun comes up, Dante begins the training. He shoves a heavy, freezing steel pistol into her shaking hands. She has never held a gun before. She is a blank slate for destruction. It brings up a scary life lesson. Our minds will adapt to pure horror much faster than any of us ever want to admit. The fact that she knows nothing about weapons is Dante's biggest advantage. He stands close, physically molding her stance, forcing her body into a rigid posture that bypasses her emotional panic. His voice is a low hum, telling her to squeeze the trigger gently, not yank it. It is a mechanical motion designed to trick the brain, making the violent act feel impersonal. The gun is just a tool. She lines up her sights on glass bottles 50 feet away. Her first 19 shots wildly miss. Her arms are shaking too hard, and the vicious recoil is bruising her shoulder. But on the 20th shot, a bottle finally shatters. The glass explodes, and something inside her brain and fundamentally clicks. A dark thrill of power washes over her. The lesson here is simple and dark. If you practice anything long enough, even violence eventually starts to feel like a twisted reward. Let the camera push in slowly on Leia. Her hands tremble as her eyes lock onto a scattered mosaic of broken glass across the concrete floor. Dante's voice cuts through the heavy silence, dark and uncompromising. He tells her that knowing how to pull a trigger means nothing. When the moment comes, the human brain screams to run. Evolution will paralyze her lungs and freeze her blood. She has to override her own humanity to consciously agree to extinguish another soul before the gun is even drawn. If she hesitates, she gives a corpse. A sudden cramp twists her stomach, and she feels the urge to be sick. The terrible weight of murder is settling into her bones. The hardest to loudest truth life is that becoming a monster to survive is always a conscious, irreversible choice. Watch the mechanical rhythm of her bruised hands. The camera focuses tight on her raw cuticles and the dark purple swelling across her palms. Leia clings to her tragedies like a lifeline. She uses Ethan's death and the image of Adrian fighting for a single breath as her fuel. She whispers her vow to fight, but Dante refuses to accept mere words. He forces her back into the agonizing loop, over and over. For 80 exhausted hours, Hayes hammers the device into her muscle memory until her conscious mind is erased. She can strip the steel weapon blind in under a minute, her battered fingers moving with lifeless precision. Her body is entirely broken, but her hesitation is dead. It teaches us a brutal reality. Pain, when repeated long enough, eventually silences the conscience. The camera tracks them through the claustrophobic shadows of the damp basement. Water drips somewhere in the dark, echoing like a metronome against her racing heart. Dante gives her nothing. No praise, no comfort. He starves her of approval to keep her nerves sharp and her eyes wide. Shooting a target is just the foundation. He drills her on how to move through doorways, how to melt into the cover of a concrete pillar, and how to read a room in a fraction of a second. The absolute rule is mental blackout. He commands her to bypass all thought. If a shadow moves with hostile intent, she is not allowed to think. She must simply fire. True survival often demands we abandon the very logic that makes us human, relying instead on the cold, primal instinct of the predator. Notice the slight hardening in Dante's jaw as he speaks of his own potential death. He discusses friendly fire with a terrifying ice-cold pragmatism, framing his murder as just another statistic they have to accept. Leia's eyes betray her lingering humanity. She is terrified of destroying innocent lives. Dante is relentless, twisting that beautiful empathy into a weapon. He uses Adrian's broken body against her, forcing her guilt into a lethal, focused rage. They make a silent pact in the shadows, accepting that they might all burn together. The scene cuts sharply to the sterile, blinding white of the recovery room. The steady hum of monitors maps Adrian's fragile heartbeat. Guilt is the most dangerous manipulator, capable of turning the gentlest soul into a willing executioner. You and I must look closely as the quiet moment by the bedside. The lighting is soft, almost knows tragic. Leia grips his feverishly warm hand, seeking permission from the very man who dragged her into this violent nightmare. She whispers her down, fully knowing he would forbid her from walking into the fire. This is where her true motive bleeds through. For 6 long years she existed as a captive ghost. Now she is violently tearing back the reins of her own fate. She leans in close, her voice trembling with a desperate intensity, begging him to open his eyes. We often fail to realize this about ourselves. People will walk willingly into absolute hell as long as they believe they are the ones. The path, control is the deepest hunger of the human heart. The heavy rustle of thick Kevlar fills the room as Dante hands over the armor. It smells of synthetic fibers and old, dried blood. He studies the quiet terror in her eyes, silently relieved. If she were completely numb, she would be a liability. Her fear is the anchor, keeping her tied to reality. The camera cuts to a looming, establishing shot of the Viscari compound. It is a brutal monolith of cold concrete and heavily armed guards. Surviving a breach here is mathematically impossible. Yet Dante's eyes hold a calculating glint. He knows their shift rotations, their tired moments, and the supreme arrogance of their leadership. A fortress is never truly impenetrable. It is only as strong as the pride of the men standing watch, and pride is always the first wall to crumble. Inside the transport van, the pre-dawn shadows paint the operatives in cold, bruised tones. The silence is suffocating. They are a ghost unit of 8, driving straight into a slaughterhouse of 20 trained killers. The camera pans across their tense jaws. A man named Lopez, his face mapped with thick, jagged scars, cracks a dark, morbid joke. For a fleeting second, forced laughter cuts through the stale air, a desperate release of raw adrenaline. But the silence crashes right back down. Leia does not smile. Her eyes are utterly vacant, retreating deep into the dark sanctuary of her conditioned mind. She pulls back the slide, ammunition confirmed, safety engaged. In the face of certain doom, the human mind will always seek shelter in the comfort of a cold, mechanical routine. Stick with me here, because this is where theory bleeds into trying reality. The massive iron silhouette of the compound cuts into the morning mist. Leia's chest rises in sharp, jagged gasps. Her heart hammers violently against her ribs, and cold sweat pools inside her tactical gloves. Dante demands absolute silence. The camera captures the soft squeal of yielding metal as they pry open the perimeter fence. They slip into the belly of the beast, a chaotic maze of towering industrial crates. The layout is a nightmare, designed to trap and disorient intruders. The safety of her basement training is gone, replaced by the suffocating grip of the unknown. We can practice for disaster our entire lives, but nothing truly prepares the soul for the moment the fire touches your skin. The frame is drowned in the sickly, yellow glare of sodium lights. Every distant footstep and muffled laugh from an unaware guard feels like a knife scraping against Leia's tense nerves. Dante weaves them through the dense shadows, inching closer to the reinforced heart of the syndicate. And then the world violently shatters. The breaching charges detonate with a concussive roar that vibrates through the floorboards. The shockwave rips away reality, plunging them into a hurricane of kinetic horror, deafening echoes, the terrifying snap of high-velocity bullets biting into concrete. Dante's unit floods into the choking smoke, and Leia is dragged into the current. There is no turning back. True survival strips away all illusion of choice, reducing a human being to raw forward motion. The narrow hallway transforms into a claustrophobic slaughterhouse. Strobe flashes of aggressive muzzle fire cast erratic shadows against the concrete walls. Just as Dante planned, Leia's conscious mind completely blacks out. A figure steps into the fatal funnel. She doesn't perceive a face, only a threat. Her finger pulls the trigger before she can breathe. The heavy recoil violently snaps her wrists. The target drops, clutching a ruined, bloody shoulder. A sudden wave of nausea crashes over her. Her soul screams in horror at the shattered body on the floor, but Dante shoves her hard from behind, forcing her boots to keep moving through the smoke. In the darkest moments of our lives, the luxury of grief must always wait until we are safely on the other side. Let us pause and look at the psychology inside this room. The heavy steel door falls away, exposing the syndicate's lavish nerve center. There sits the patriarch, Carlo Viscari. The camera pushes in on his face, waiting for a flicker of panic, but there is none. Surrounded by operatives with weapons raised, his heart rate does not even spike. He looks at Dante not with terror, but with a bone-chilling, arrogant boredom. He dismisses the guns pointed at his chest as a mere inconvenience. His sociopathic calm is utterly disconnected from the brutal reality of the moment. It is a haunting reflection of human nature. Supreme arrogance blinds even the most ruthless predators to their own fragile mortality. Believing you are untouchable is exactly the flaw that guarantees your final downfall. The tension is suffocating. Carlo sinks into his leather chair, a portrait of dark majesty, entirely ignoring the blood pooling beneath his tailored suit. He turns his predatory gaze upon Leia, his voice dripping with his force calls her by her old name. It is a calculated psychological strike designed to drag her backward into her victimhood. Leia's shoulders tense, her jaw locking in violent rejection. With surgical precision as the Shrijallosa priest, Carlo rips open her defense wounds. He told her that Ethan never loved her, that he only molded her like clay to show off a prized possession. He mocks her trembling weapon, calling her a broken pawn playing soldier in a war zone. The most devastating wounds are never inflicted by bullets, but by the cruel words that validate our deepest, darkest insecurities. A sadistic smirk curls across Carlo's face, driving the final blade into her psyche. He coldly states that Ethan's death was entirely her fault. In the ruthless hierarchy of this empire, a man who cannot control his own wife is a liability to words that must be erased. The force of his words hits Leia's like a physical blow. The focuses on her finger, trembling violently against the cold steel trigger. Dante the Bishop barks her names, desperate to pull her out of the psychological freefall, but the damage is done. She begins to whisper the names of the dead, pulling the crushing weight of blood onto her own soul. Carlo throws his head back and laughs at her misery. Guilt is a dark and terrible prison, and if we are not careful, we will willingly lock the door from the inside. Carlo's laughter echoes through the cold room, holding the empty amusement of a man completely stripped of his soul. He mocks their bond and promising a slow, agonizing end. Let us look closely here, you and I. Life teaches us that arrogance is always a fragile shield. Dante shatters it, ending the speech with a single deafening gunshot to Carlo's left chest. The violence snaps the silence in two. Carlo jerks backward, a brilliant crimson stain blooming across his immaculate white shirt. His eyes go wide with the shock of a monster realizing he can finally bleed. Absolute chaos erupts. A woman screams, and younger Viscari heir scrambles away like a cornered beast. Automatic gunfire tears through the plaster. Leia hits the floor hard, diving behind a heavy wooden table as a massive flood of enemy reinforcements chokes the dark corridor. Dante flat out refuses to retreat. His dark fixation on killing the threat completely overrides his desire to live, dropping 2 advancing guards in a heartbeat. From the shadows, Leia watches the younger Viscari scramble toward a hidden exit. This is the tragic moment that a victim finally takes control of her own fate. She abandons all fear, sprinting directly across the deadly room. Bullets violently tear through the plaster just inches from her head, but her eyes never leave the target. She intercepts the young heir exactly as his trembling hand grabs the door handle. He turns, raising his weapon, but Leia fires first. The shot is wild, born of pure blinding panic, but the bullet brutally tears through the muscle in his leg. He collapses to the wooden floor, screaming in agony. Leia stands over his bleeding body, the heavy gun shaking in her hands. A chilling numbness washes over Leia. When she commands him to stay down, her voice emerges flat and hollow. It is the haunting sound of a woman completely detached from her own humanity. The bleeding boy defies her, spitting blood and daring her to pull the trigger. Her finger tightens. In a single breath, her mind flashes to Adrian bleeding out, and 6 long years of endless torment. But life teaches us that true strength sometimes lies in refusing to become the monster they created. She cannot execute him in cold blood. She lowers the weapon. The heir sighs in profound relief, a comfort that lasts exactly 1 second before Dante casually puts a bullet through his head. The deafening crack and the sudden, horrific spray of red make Leia violently sick to her stomach. Without a second glance, Dante grabs her trembling arm and roars for an immediate evacuation. Pure survival instinct takes over. They plunge down the stairwell, rushing through a dark maze choked with thick smoke and fallen men. Whenever guards emerge from the shadows, Dante cuts them down with the cold grace of a starving wolf. Leia is trapped in her own mind. The deafening gunfire fades into a high, sustained ringing. Her vision shrinks to a narrow tunnel, and she cannot even feel her own feet hitting the ground. All she sees is the looping, bloody image of the boy dying. They burst through the heavy doors into absolute chaos. Piercing sirens wail into the night sky, and blinding searchlights wash over the security forces. Dante charges madly toward the outer fence. Even when Lopez takes a brutal bullet to the ribs, the men grab him by his bloody collar, dragging his heavy body through the broken perimeter and into the terrifying darkness. Look closely at them now, you and I, as the fiery adrenaline finally burns away into pure terror. They collapse into the getaway car, tires screaming as the driver floors the gas. Leia huddles in the back, gasping for air as violent tremors shake her bones. Her hands are painted red, and her fractured mind cannot tell if it is her own blood or the dead boy's. Dante presses a phone to his ear. He confirms the kills, but admits they have been heavily compromised. The voice on the other end is just a dark murmur, yet Dante's jaw clenches like solid stone. When Leia weakly begs for the truth, Dante turns to her, his eyes carrying absolute dread. He reveals the enemy's final devastating trap. A hit squad has been sent directly to their hidden safe house. Leia feels her heart completely stop beating. Adrian is lying there in the dark, entirely defenseless. Dante quietly runs the brutal numbers in his head. Their guards are vastly outnumbered, the gates are already breached, and they are 30 agonizing minutes away. Raw, unfiltered panic erupts from Leia. She screams at the driver Bert to go faster, tearing her throat until it tastes like copper. The car violently shakes, pushed to the absolute edge of breaking apart. Time is the cruelest thief when you are desperate,
making a second stretched into eternity. Leia pictures Adrian lying in that quiet bed, trapped in a helpless coma.
Desperate to keep her mind from fracturing, she checks her heavy pistol. Three bullets left. Her hands tremble so violently she can barely hold the magazine. Dante fiercely orders her to stay hidden in the car when they arrive, but true love always demands we walk into the fire. She will never let Adrian die alone. She completely accepts that she might not survive the night. Finally refusing to play the quiet victim, Dante searches her eyes, seeing that terrifying resolve. He orders her to mirror his every step and run the second he commands it. You and I have seen this rare, powerful shift before, haven't we? That fleeting moment when a broken chooses to become the warrior. The dark cabin emerges through the trees, and the sight is catastrophic. Lifeless bodies litter the muddy ground. The vehicle slams to a halt, and Dante's men pour out with weapons raised. Leia trails closely behind,
her violently hammering against her ribs as the heavy echo of gunshots rings out from inside the house. They step through the shattered doorway together.
The living room is a literal slaughterhouse. Furniture is splintered into pieces, and every single wall is painted in tragedy. Thick, dark blood coats the wooden floors. The elite guards Dante left behind have been utterly wiped out, but down the shadowed hallway, a terrifying standoff is unfolding. A nameless assassin stands calmly over Adrian's helpless body. The man has the dead, empty eyes of a true sociopath. His voice is chillingly flat as he orders them to drop their weapons, promising to put a bullet straight through Adrian's head if they flinch. Dante freezes in the doorway, his finger resting nervously on the trigger. Leia begins to shake so violently she can barely stand. The killer offers a ghost of a smile, basking in his absolute control over their fate. Then a weak, broken wisp of floats up from the heavy sheets. Adrian is barely awake, his mind drowning in thick painkillers and agonizing torment, yet he desperately forces his pale lips to breathe Leia's name. Fighting through agonizing pain, Adrian's weary eyes lock onto Leia. His first instinct is to beg her to run, but the assassin quickly shuts that down. The killer makes the rules clear. One wrong move, and Adrian dies instantly. Dante steps forward, desperately trying to negotiate. The assassin just shrugs, explaining that his boss is dead and his contract is void. He is staying purely out of a twisted need to finish the bleeding job. He glares at Leia, blaming her for burning his criminal world to the ground. His plan is painfully cruel. He intends to force her to watch the man she loves die, and then slaughter the room. Leia's terrified eyes dart to the heavy pistol she was forced to drop. Stripped of all her power, she falls to her trembling knees and begins to desperately beg, offering the smiling monster absolutely anything he desires. We have to stop and truly examine this tragic crossroads together. You and I. The killer smiles and hands Leia an impossible choice. He tells her to pick up her gun and end her own life, promising that Adrian will live. All Leia can hear is the deafening drumming of her own heart. Adrian fights against his shattered body, coughing up blood as he tries to scream at her to stop, but the assassin presses a heavy hand against his wounded chest. Leia looks down at Adrian. This is the man who pulled her out of the dark, who carefully glued her broken pieces back together. She glances at Dante, whose stoic face twists into pure, helpless horror. In the end, true devotion always buries the basic instinct to survive. She slowly walked toward the cold firearm, tuning out Adrian's raw, agonizing cries of pure despair. She stares into the killer's eyes, desperately begging him to swear he will keep his word.
His twisted integrity, Dante roars,
begging her not to fall for this sick game. But Leia slowly raises the steel barrel to her own temple. Notice how her trembling hands suddenly go completely still. Accepting your own death brings a strange, terrifying peace. She whispers a earful apology to Adrian. He thrashes against the mattress, screaming and cursing her name.
Fighting a body that will not move. She tells him
she loves him, and she firmly pulls the trigger.
A loud, metallic click echoes through the room. The chamber is empty. The assassin blinks,
his cruel brain stalling in sheer confusion. In that tiny fractured second, Dante explodes forward like a coiled spring, violently snapping the killer's wrist and tearing the deadly weapon away. The stray gun fires wildly, tearing thick chunks of plaster from the ceiling. Dante tackles the killer, driving his mass straight through the drywall in a brutal struggle for the weapon. Leia snaps back to reality in an instant. She spots a discarded pistol lying near a fallen guard. She scoops it up just as the assassin violently breaks Dante's hold, swinging her barrel towards Dante's chest. Leia does not blink. She pulls the trigger, burying a bullet deep into the killer's ribs. He staggers, his dead eyes snapping toward her in pure rage. Leia stands her ground and empties the entire magazine into his chest, firing until the metal simply clicks. The monster finally crumples into a bleeding heap. A heavy, suffocating silence rushes back into the room. Leia drops the smoking gun. Adrian opens his mouth, but the sheer trauma has left him entirely mute. Let us open this file together, you and I, and observe the exact frame where a shattered soul binds itself to its breaker. Leia collapses beside the blood-soaked bed. Her voice a fragile whisper pouring desperate apologies over the orchestrated nightmare. Adrian grips her trembling hand, his throat ruined, his words a gravelly rasp, calling her insane. She had turned a gun on herself just to save him, oblivious to its empty chamber. It is a harsh truth of life. Sometimes our deepest wounds disguise themselves as love.
He orders her never to risk her life again, then, but she merely reflects his dark devotion, whispering that he would have done the same. They are drowning in a shared delusion,
clinging to one another, until Dante defractures the scene, warning that more men are coming. Watch the subtle shift in gravity. Leia, once a terrified captive, now studies Adrian with a medic's cold focus, asking Dante if the bleeding kingpin can survive a journey. Fueled by arrogant will, Adrian forces himself upright, insisting his shattered body can walk. They heave his weight into the extraction van. As they tear into the night, Leia stares out the glass, her eyes grieving the burning wreckage of the hell she knew. It is human nature to cling to our cages when we fear the unknown sky. She asks Dante if the Viscari War is over, and he nods, confirming a fragile peace. Adrian rests his heavy head against Leia's shoulder. His red showers does the dark, steady rhythm she anxious her entire existence to. As they speed away toward another beautifully hidden prison, Leia squeezes her eyes shut, fighting the suffocating wave of her altered reality. She has crossed a line drawn in blood, taking human lives and offering her own heart as collateral. The trembling girl Adrian, pulled from that damp alleyway, no longer exists. She has been burned away, leaving behind a hardened mirror of the monster who took her. Transformation always demands a brutal sacrifice of the old self. The van rolls up to a waterfront fortress. a concrete stronghold wrapped in corporate secrecy that flawlessly masquerades as a quiet vacation home. They arrive exactly as dawn breaks. The sky bleeds soft pink and brilliant gold across the calm water. It casts a devastatingly beautiful illusion of peace over three souls completely drenched in irreversible psychological trauma. Observe the dark machinery that keeps a predator breathing. Adrian is fading, a broken shell forced forward only by sheer stubbornness. Dante and Leia carry his lifeless weight across the threshold into the living room. An underground doctor waits in the shadows, her sharp eyes scanning the ruined kingpin. Power can buy silence, but it can never negotiate with death. The doctor's grim assessment sends Leia's nervous system into a panicked frenzy. Vinci, the physician, demands a hospital. A plea Dante rejects with a voice like cracked ice. Adrian must remain perfectly still, or he will drown in his own blood. The doctor orders 2 weeks of absolute rest, warning that a full month is truly needed to prevent catastrophe. Dante nods once, accepting the grim terms without hesitation. The doctor shifts her gaze to Leia, taking in the horrific poetry of her survival. Leia stands wrapped in clothes heavy with dried blood. Her hands are torn, a dark bruise shadowing her temple. Like any survivor carrying heavy trauma, Leia minimizes her pain, whispering that she is fine. But ignoring our wounds never heals them, it only buries them. The doctor dismisses her denial, pointing her toward a hallway to strip away the horror. The invisible chain binding Leia to Adrian pulls tight. She physically resists walking away, yet, looking down at his pale, motionless face and listening to his shallow breaths, she realizes her dark anchor is stationary. Defeated by sheer exhaustion, she turns her back and walks away to finally wash off the blood. In the shower, Leia turns the water to scalding heat, a desperate ritual to shock her shattered nervous system. She scrubs her skin until the burning eclipses the phantom weight of the gun she fired. She tries to melt away the agonizing memory of pressing cold steel to her own skull. The hardest lesson of survival is that you can never wash away what you have become. Stepping out in a trance, she finds fresh clothes neatly arranged by unseen hands. She pulls them on with absolute mechanical detachment. She took 3 or 4 lives tonight, their faces already blurring into dark shapes. She braces for the inevitable moral collapse, the crushing horror of guilt. But as she searches her battered soul, she discovers only a cold, profound, and terrifying emotional emptiness. Beneath the numbness, a terrifying adaptation blooms. A chilling realization takes root. She would gladly pull the trigger and kill them all over again. When we embrace darkness to protect what we love, the monster inside us stops hiding. Such a moral collapse should spark panic, but it only brings heavy mental exhaustion. She drifts back the living space, watching Dante bark rapid damage control in sharp Italian. Leia drops to the floor beside the unconscious kingpin. Clear fluids and heavy sedatives flow into his veins, buying his body time. Dante lowers his phone, his face carved with germ shadows. He looks down at them and delivers a heavy truth. Adrian will survive the night, but only if they can keep this fragile sanctuary perfectly sealed from the violence outside. Dante sinks into a chair, mapping out the grim architecture of the underworld. The Viscari may be headless, he explains, but power vacuums always breed chaos. New predators will inevitably rise to hunt them down. This paranoia is their permanent reality. Leia stares at the broken man beside her, whispering a desperate wish to walk away. But true freedom requires knowing who are without your chains. Dante leans forward, coldly asking where she would even go. Her silence exposes a terrifying lack of identity. Then, With devastating psychological precision, he praises her brutal efficiency in the firefight. He takes her suicidal, shattered desperation and expertly spins it into a beautiful tale of dark heroism, sealing her trauma bond tighter than ever before. Dante surgically strips away her guilt. He reminds her that pulling the trigger is the only reason Adrian is breathing. When she confesses she didn't know the gun was empty, Dante asks a damning question. If it had been loaded, would she have pulled it anyway? Her shoulders, the trembling in her jaw answers before she can speak. We reveal our truest selves, not in words, but in what we are willing to die for. Dante smiles grimly, validating her dark choices. He crowns her a fully evolved survivor of their world, then quietly leaves the room. For 3 grueling hours, she sits with the bleeding kingpin and the haunting crash of the ocean waves. Suddenly, a tiny, ragged hitch in Adrian's breathing snaps Stas, her hyper-vigilant mind instantly awake. Stick with me, because you and I must look closely at what happens next. Leia finds the narcissist awake, his dark eyes locked onto her. He forces a bitter joke to hide his weakness. Rasping that feeling like he got shot makes perfect sense. His ego tries to force his broken body upright, but blinding pain slams him down. Leia rushes forward, her hands adjusting his pillows to protect his torn flesh. He mocks her sudden obedience to the doctor. Confronting death is often the only thing that teaches us how to protect life. His face softens into a rare, calculated tenderness. He'd ask Golza for running into a bloodbath to save him, demanding she never risk her life for his again. Without missing a beat, she holds his stare and throws his exact logic right back at him. The bleeding kingpin twists his own reality, arguing that his sacrifices are different from hers. He paints a fabricated picture of a future, insisting she still has the pure to escape this underworld. But light means nothing to a soul that has learned to thrive in the dark. Leia leans in close, her face inches from his. She shatters his fantasy, whispering that she doesn't even want to leave. Adrian tightens his grip on her hand, trying to anchor her as he describes his world. An endless, suffocating cycle of blood and brutality. He begs her to believe she is an innocent anomaly. Leia simply stares into his eyes and lists the men she just slaughtered. With every drop of blood young aunt recounts, she proves her innocence died the very second he pulled her from the shadows. Adrian tries to claw back his power, ordering her to forge a new name, bury the nightmare, and disappear. But Leia rejects the escape, refusing to be a helpless victim running from her shadow. True empowerment sometimes wears a terrifying, jagged mask. Adrian aggressively pivots, dismissing her bravery as blind, animalistic survival. Leia leans over his ruined body, finally seizing control of her life in the most beautifully broken way possible. She coldly dissects her tragic history. For 6 years, her former abuser built the walls of her reality. Then Adrian stole her, locking her inside a fortified cage under the guise of salvation. Her voice never wavers as she admits the darkest truth. She only let him play the savior because her mind was already completely destroyed. The madness of this narrative reaches its absolute zenith in a single devastating frame. The sterile lighting of the room casts sharp shadows over Leia's face as she breathes out the ultimate surrender, declaring her captivity a conscious choice. She is actively locking herself inside the cage, explicitly choosing the warden who built it. The words detonate in the heavy air between them. Adrian, ever the architect of violence, recognizes the fracture in her mind, the acute shock, the sheer trauma. Yet Leia pushes the tragedy to its breaking point, verbalizing a deeply romantic attachment. The ensuing silence is devastating. She has convinced herself that his ruthless absolute control is the magnificent illusion of total freedom. You and I must recognize the sheer devastation in this final exchange. The camera lingers on Adrian. A rare, almost most imperceptible tremor breaks through his impenetrable armor as he tries to reject her devotion. He lists his own monstrous sins, confessing to being a fundamentally lethal creature. But Leia only clings tighter to the ruins of her soul, her eyes burning with an obstinate fire. She weaponizes his fleeting moments of calculated protection, equating his violent criminality with her own shattered morality. When tells her she needs a healthy, safer life, she violently rejects the very idea of healing. She demands the darkness. For a long, suffocating moment, the predator merely stares, studying the tragic masterpiece he has ruthlessly sculpted. The lighting shifts, plunging them into a haunting intimacy. He pulls her down until their foreheads rest against one another, a brilliantly calculated gesture of false vulnerability. "You are going to regret this," he whispers into the space between them, expertly laying the emotional chains of her subjugation. He promises her absolutely no safety. "Normal got me beaten," Leia answers, her voice trembling with the weight of her trauma. She craves the familiar chaos now. She leans in and kisses him, a desperate collision tasting of salt and fresh blood, mistaking her primal survival instinct for a grand, sweeping romance. He returns it with a savage, calculated hunger. When they finally part, his whispered declaration of love cements her tragic doom. "Step into the frame with me, because this is where the psychological trap finally snaps shut." Leia asks what next, the muscles in her neck tightening with the sheer terror of the unknown. Adrian whispers a promise of healing, painting a beautiful, entirely hollow illusion of a shared tomorrow. Cut to the outside world, the criminal ecosystem is tearing itself apart. The rivals' syndicate collapses into a blood-soaked chaos of sirens and circling vultures. But inside their fortified walls, the air is thick and time simply stops. Adrian heals slowly, carefully positioning himself as the fragile heart of the entire universe. In the shadows, his loyal Lieutenant Dante quietly pulls the strings, ensuring Leia remains perfectly trapped. Within this quiet incubation, a dangerous dissonance takes root. Leia experiences days without immediate physical terror, and she no longer measures every single breath. A false liberation that actually tortures her highly strung nervous system. The repressed trauma bleeds out when the sun goes down. She wakes up violently shivering, the deafening echo of a gunshot and the dark red pooling of blood seared into her retinas. She's in the pitch black, and Adrian holds her trembling frame, using her calculated, breathless silence that she tragically misreads as pure empathy. By day, she stares out at the crashing ocean, pretending this cage is a home. But the illusion shatters when Marcus steps into the light. His predatory grin, bringing the violence right back. The camera tracks Marcus as he leans against the doorframe, casually noting that she had finally gone to war. She looks at her own hands, describing the sensation as falling into an abyss and finally hitting the concrete floor, a haunting realization of her shattered psyche, finding stability in the absolute dark. Soon after, the brutal training resumes. We see the sweat dripping from her brow, her muscles pushed to an agonizing breaking point as she desperately tries to purge the trauma from her veins. She is trying to rebuild a soul that no longer exists. Then on the 23rd day, the atmosphere shifts. Adrian rises from his chair, a silent, imposing shadow reclaiming his throne. They gather around the heavy oak table like a deeply corrupted family. The dim overhead light casts long shadows across Dante's face as he outlines their grim reality. The rival faction is gone, but the bloody power vacuum is already attracting hungry wolves. Dante suggests washing the blood from their hands, liquidating the empire, and disappearing forever, but Leia's eyes narrow. Her newly fractured mind violently rejects the promise of a peaceful life. She calls it running. The only other path is a descent into pure madness, seizing the throne and drowning in eternal paranoia. Adrian's gaze remains chillingly calm. Then, in a masterful display of manipulation, he slowly turns his dark eyes to Leia, asking for her command. The sheer surprise on her face seals her doom. The brilliant illusion of choice is the final nail. The camera zooms in slightly, capturing the very moment her soul is permanently anchored to his. Leia thinks back to the fragile, terrified woman bleeding out in the freezing rain, the one who would have begged for a quiet, invisible life. That woman is a ghost now. She speaks aloud, her voice eerily steady, articulating the most tragic delusion of all. The belief that drowning in his violence is the only way to never be drowned again. She demands that they ground, cold, rationalizing future bludge as their only shield. Marcus watches from the corner, his lips curling into a deeply sinister smile. Adrian lets her words hang in the heavy air, savoring the victory before softly declaring they will rebuild this empire into an unbreachable fortress. Dante's jaw tightens. He knows they have just declared a bloody war, but Adrian's voice is remarkably smooth, painting the impending slaughter as a beautiful monument of strength. In the cold days that follow, a ruthless purge begins. The director's lens shows Adrian severing ties, eliminating any soul with a flicker of hesitation in their eyes. Through it all, Leia watches the darkness unfold. She watches human lives moved across a board like utterly disposable pieces of wood. She drinks in the poison of their underworld. Lying to her own reflection in the mirror, she tells herself this brutality is somehow pure, somehow more honest than the quiet, suffocating cruelty of her past life with Ethan. It is a desperate defense mechanism built to mask a shattered mind. The tragic irony drips from the frame. She actually believes these monsters are honorable simply because they wear their sins out in the open. 6 weeks later, the sky bleeds an agonizing orange as she stands on the balcony, watching the sun disappear. Adrian steps out from the shadows behind her, his predatory grace completely restored. His low voice grazes her ear, asking if she regrets letting the dying girl fade away to become the villain's shadow. She looks into the eyes of a killer and swears she has zero regrets. He rewards her devotion by wrapping his arms around her waist. She leans back and finding warmth in the exact fire that burned her life down. Then she drops the final match. Ethan's estate is crumbling. At her abuser's name, her entire body turns to ice. His tone is terrifyingly casual as he tells her the world has officially declared her dead. Every trace of the woman she was has been wiped from the earth. He lays out a grand theatrical choice. Step back into the light to reclaim her name, or stay here in the shadows as a permanent ghost. It is a brilliant, cruel test of her chains. He opens the cage door, absolutely certain the bird will never fly away. Leia stares out at the horizon, the memory of her gilded, miserable past flashing before her eyes. With a voice devoid of all warmth, she tells him to let it all burn to the ground. He seals the death of her innocence with a slow, approving kiss. The sky goes completely black as she asks what happens now. His answer is a chilling promise of absolute rain. Looking at the tragic poetry of this final scene.
Ensuring he remains completely unmoored in his violent tide.
She whispers her deepest fear, that she might lose him. The irony is agonizing. The lamb is now weeping at the thought of losing the wolf. He offers absolutely no comfort, bluntly telling her there are no guarantees in a life written in blood. It is a staggering manipulation, dressing up cold terror as profound honesty. He cups her trembling face in his large, scarred hands, swearing only that if they will drown together. And when she kisses him under the dark sky, the panic desperation is gone. It has frozen into a permanent, terrifying, and an irreversible submission. The camera lingers as they pull apart. Adrian offers a gentle smile, a flash of teeth in the dim light, calibrated to secure her devotion. He whispers his love, a confession hanging heavy in the shadowed room. Leia does not flinch. She replies that she loves the very monster breathing beneath his skin. This is the tragic climax of their bond, where poison becomes the cure. 14 days later, we cut to a steel and glass penthouse in the clouds. By all logic, stepping into a crime lord's fortress should terrify any sane mind. Yet Leia enters this high-altitude cage as if walking into a quiet sanctuary. She is no longer collateral damage. She is molding herself into the architect of his empire. Sometimes the hardest lesson is this: we do not always run from our darkest fears. Occasionally, we build a home inside them. Let us look closely at this next frame together, 'cause it captures the exact moment her soul truly mutates. Dante keeps his position, but Leia seamlessly slips into the seat of power. Picture the stark, cold lighting of a sterile conference room. 90 days later, a trembling debtor sits across from her, weeping, offering the ragged excuses of a drowning man. Leia simply watches him. Her eyes are blank, absorbing his terror with an icy calm. When she leans across the polished table, the camera pushes in. She speaks with Adrian's exact rhythm, flat, hollow, wiped entirely clean of human warmth. "Pay by Friday," she whispers quietly, "or lose everything you have ever built." The lesson here is brutal but honest. If you choose to wear a mask of ruthless cruelty for long enough, it will eventually become your real face. The scene holds on the man's face as all color drains away. Her promise of violence hangs in the quiet air, absolute and unforgiving. He begs for a grace period that will never come. And 72 hours later, the debt is settled. From the shadowed corner of the room, Dante watches her proud, chilling smile, the physical proof of a fractured mind venting itself through pure malice. We cut to the deep blues of a moonlit bedroom, tangled in the heavy shots of their fortress. Leia traces Adrian's chest and asks if her new darkness scares him. He only pulls the book closer, whispering that this cruelty is a true strength. He loves the monster she has become. The tragedy we must all understand is this: trauma does not just break the human heart, it completely remakes it. Be very careful who holds your pieces when you rebuild. Stay with me as the camera pulls back, revealing the depth of her transformation. When he kissed her, the feeling anchoring her chest was never peace in minutes. It was something heavier, a cold, hard certainty. She had finally stopped running. The painful noise in her head vanished, and leaving absolutely no regrets in its wake, we dissolved to 6 months later. Heavy rain pours relentlessly over a grey, sprawling graveyard. The lens focuses on a single pitiful headstone. Ethan, her tormentor, lies beneath a plain, flat rock. There is no grand statue, just a name fading in the cold downpour. She stands over him, totally still beneath the weeping sky. This frame teaches us a quiet, essential truth. The closure we spend our lives chasing does not come from burying our enemies, but from the realization that we have finally stopped running. The grey light catches the sharp angles of her face as she stares down at the wet earth. She had come here expecting a grand wave of tears, a sudden rush of vindication. Instead, her shoulders slump with nothing but bone-deep exhaustion. I am not sorry you are gone, she whispers quietly, the words cut cleanly through the sound of the falling rain. I'm only sorry it took me so long to see exactly what you were. The muddy grave offers no argument. She mourns the lost years, the time spent twisting her own soul to survive his madness. I outlived you, she says, her voice steadying into steel. I am no longer the fragile girl you tried to crush. I am something far more dangerous. It is a heavy truth we all must face. Simply outlasting the forces that were designed to destroy you is the greatest, most absolute victory of all. The camera follows her as she pivots on her heel, leaving the dead to the rain. Adrian waits by a sleek black car, offering the silent, heavy support of a man who intimately understands darkness. He asks no questions as she slides into the leather seat. The graveyard fades in the rearview mirror, washing away the last remnants of her old life. We cut forward 12 months. Warm amber light floods their sprawling library, the neon pulse of the dangerous city humming far below the glass. Adrian steps into the vism, his jaw tight. We have a problem, he murmurs. The camera catches the slight, knowing tilt of her head. Then, let us be smarter, she replies, calmly closing her heavy book. This is the quiet lesson of survival. When sudden chaos comes violently knocking at your door, the truly grounded mind never panics. It only adapts. You and I have watched so many tragedies where the broken never rise again. But in this wide shot, Leia and Adrian stand shoulder to shoulder, two predators in a city that eats the weak alive. She finally understands that surviving is never about dodging the blade. It is about learning how to stitch your own wounds. Her definition of love has mutated. It is no longer a soft safety net, but a sharp, deliberate weapon they wield together. She has found a cold capacity for violence buried deep within her ribs. The terrified girl who bled loud in that dark alley is entirely gone, leaving only Leia, a woman with no past, requiring no surname. It is a jarring but vital truth to carry with you. Sometimes, to truly survive the fire, you have to let it burn your old identity to ash, destroying the very cage it once built around your soul. Here is a woman who marched directly into a blazing inferno and sat down upon its throne. The rain against the glass finally stops. The camera pans down to the sprawling city below, its golden lights glowing like a vast, pulsing nervous system in the dark. Adrian reaches out, his fingers brushing against hers. When she grips his hand in return, there is no hesitation. There is no captive, no savior, no ghost of a fractured victim. Just two deeply scarred souls standing amidst the smoking wreckage of their pasts, deciding to build an empire out of the ruins. The screen slowly fades to black on this final, lingering thought. True freedom never looks the way they tell you it should. It is rarely clean, it is never simple, and more often than not, it is a messy, beautiful chaos that belongs to absolutely no one but yourself.